Thank you for joining us. I'm Rusty Lloyd. I'm the Executive Director of Rivers Edge West. This is part of our webinar series. I would like to welcome a great lineup of speakers today. First off, you'll be hearing from Sylvia Hickenlooper, who is the soil conservationist for the Natural Resource Conservation Service in Colorado here. Next, we'll be hearing from Tina Booten, who's the Weld County Weed Division Supervisor for Weld County Parks Public Works. And then we'll be hearing from Scott Nissen, who is an extension specialist through the Weed Science program at Colorado State University. Again, very knowledgeable speakers on controlling weeds and herbicides. So I hope you enjoy the presentations. And again, thank you for joining us for this webinar series. So I'll turn it over to Kara and Sylvia, and we'll get it rolling with our first presentation. Thank you.
Awesome, great. Well, thank you, and good morning, everyone. My name, as I mentioned earlier, is Sylvia Hickenlooper. I've worked for Natural Resource Conservation Service in the Longmont and Fort Collins field offices now for about 18 years. I started in California working with NRCS and have been soil and range work over the past couple years. And so I always I know a lot of people know who NRCS is, and I'm going to give just kind of a brief introduction of who our agency is in just a little bit, but to kind of give like what I call my elevator spiel of what I do in the day-to-day life of a soil con is essentially my job is to work with private landowners and land managers to help address natural resource concerns on their property. And then also develop a conservation plan. And from that conservation plan, we have sometimes cost share assistance to help them implement those practices. And so the whole kind of tagline of our agency is helping people help the land. And that's truly what we do. On a day-to-day basis, in each field office that we work in might have different goals and objectives for their offices, but just kind of giving you a little quick overview of what I do. Through my presentation this morning, I'm going to be talking just a brief introduction of holistic land management. It's one of those things when I was in college and I didn't really know what I was going to do with the rest of my life. I took a course in holistic management, and it was kind of my aha moment. And shortly after having that course, I was introduced to NRCS and an internship where we don't necessarily do or write holistic management plans for producers, but what I do try to do is help guide them through that process. And so I'm just going to be doing a brief introduction of what holistic land management is in this presentation. A little bit of a historical overview of who NRCS is as well. And then talking about what is holistic land management and how do we actually apply that to the landscape. So, many people are familiar with NRCS, but we don't have this like large ad campaign or, most of how people get to know us is through word of mouth. And I think that the way that our agency was formed, just the history of our agency has always been, to me, what makes me passionate about what we do, and also why we work with conservation planning and why we look at the landscapes on a whole. But we were literally born out of the Dust Bowl. Hugh Hemmett Bennett was a soil scientist that worked with USGS, a division of Soil Erosion Service, and he was extremely concerned with what was going on with our nation's soils at the time. And he was urging Congress to really be able to look at how can we help mitigate and reduce soil erosion? He wanted to have an agency that would help private landowners in tackling this large resource concern, and that's kind of where we got our roots, was really looking at soil erosion. And in 1935 is when we became an agency, and from the very beginning, we've always been voluntary and non-regulatory agency. So people have to want to reach out to us in order to implement this technical assistance or cost share assistance that we have. And I would say probably 99% of the time, it usually starts with someone has a problem. Hopefully they haven't reached this level of erosion or, stream degradation, that's sometimes depicted in these pictures. But typically there's a problem and they want help addressing that problem. And so once they request that service, then we can help them and working with them. But really, our roots started in that soil erosion, management and mitigation, and we've since moved to being now the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And so now I just want to move into what is holistic. And I know it's always exciting when you have a presentation and they bring out the definition of the word in their presentation. But when we're talking about holistic land management, I think really wrapping our head that holistic is this kind of big idea word. It's a philosophy. I went to school for natural resources. I didn't go to school for philosophy. So it's something it's a hard sell, and we have to get kind of creative in how we help encourage people to kind of take on this management for their own properties as well. The definition itself says it's characterized by the comprehension of the parts as something that's intimately interconnected and explicitly only by reference to the whole. How do we even categorize that when it comes to natural resources? Well, a lot of times when we're working with whatever property, there's multi-resource concerns that we're looking at that really do make up a whole, or the whole system, or the property. And we'll get into those just a little bit more. But when we think of the word holistic and we think of it in our minds, what it looks like, oftentimes we get these kind of images. I mean, when we talk about holistic health, mind, body, spirit, it's kind of this whole connection of all those, or aligning chakras. And so this picture kind of represents the clients that I work with, the landowners and the land users. And if I was to start my first meeting with them saying, we're going to talk about holistic land management, they're probably going to shut down on me a little bit. Because it does kind of sound like this new wave kind of just kind of a topic that they're probably not quite familiar about, having an approach of somebody coming out on their property, helping them with. And so really what my goal is to kind of help plant the seeds. I really want to give them information to help them build their own holistic management plan for their property, if that's a route they choose to proceed. And so I do that by multitude of different processes, but I think it really helps to kind of understand what is holistic land management. And if you do a Google search or any type of web search, and you do just the image search, you're gonna get these kind of pictures when you pull up holistic land management. Love fence line comparisons of one side that's been managed holistically and the other side that is not. I couldn't find any pictures with streams in them, but might have been more appropriate for this presentation. But oftentimes this is a great visual, but it leaves us asking, like, how do we get to this type of management? And I think, the person that I learned from the textbook was Alan Savory. He has the book on holistic management. And, he really kind of started, his journey with this actually in opposition of wildlife, and seeing that, not wildlife, sorry, livestock, and seeing that they were degrading the landscape. But after spending time observing them and watching them, we realized that it's truly the management behind many of these systems that degrade it. So helping give people the tools to really look at how to manage for the whole. And oftentimes we see these pictures of like cattle being bunched together and moved in frequent grazing, and we think that this is holistic land management. And it's just a tool, and it's just one aspect of this type of management. So I want to kind of dive in a little bit more about what it actually is. And probably the most important part is really defining a goal and making your decisions so that they're always based off of that goal. And so when I'm working with producers, this is usually one of the first steps before I start to implement a conservation plan with them, or before even talking to them about cost share assistance. So I really want them to know what their goal is, short term and long term, and how are they going to base their decisions off of that goal. Another aspect that I don't necessarily help them with, but I definitely encourage them to look into, is really their financial planning. I mean, we can help with cost share assistance. We can cost share on a wide variety of different conservation practices, but if it doesn't really make financial sense for their operation, and they haven't taken the time to really plan through that, it might not be the most successful avenue for them. And then I also encourage them to look at how are their marketing and their business planning. Not that I necessarily get involved with them with that, but definitely encourage them to look at those avenues as well. And so I know there's a lot of words on this, so I just kind of want to break it down, and how we incorporate, through NRCS, we use the 9 steps of conservation planning, but how we also try to incorporate that into holistic land management as well. But probably the first and the most important one is just changing the way that we make decisions. Like, it's a complete mind shift. We get so used to doing the same thing every day. We're creatures of habit, and we like routines, and we do what works for us because we know that if I do this, my planned outcome is always going to be this. And so working in that area of known, we tend to follow the same way that we've always done things. And so when we're looking at things from a holistic management perspective, we really have to change that way that we make decisions. And I use this as an analogy. If we were in an interactive, I have little exercises and stuff that I like to use. But if you just think about the way that you might drive to the store, or you might, bike to the park, however you go, you might have a set way that you always go. And if you were to just change the way that you go and get a different kind of scenery or a different route, maybe it's faster, maybe it's longer, you still get to the end result, but you have a different experience along the way. And that's really the same thing with holistic land management. And then really defining what is the whole, right? A lot of times people want to, we're programmed to do quick fix, and we want to identify the problem. I have this weed, or I have this grass, or, I've got this erosion taking place on the stream bank. But really, what is the whole thing that we're managing? It's easy to identify those certain components, but really kind of getting people to wrap around the whole system and the whole. And then really, again, I go back to that. Now that you kind of can change the way you make decisions and you know what it is that you want to manage, now let's start to look at identifying the goal. And the best way that I do this is I don't say, let's sit down and form a holistic goal. What I ask people to do is, after we've identified what some of the resource concerns on the property are, and maybe some areas that are working and areas that are not working, is I ask them to take money out of the equation. I want them to think that they have money and time abundantly. How would they want that property to look so that everything was functioning in a way that they feel good about at night? Like they would, not stress or worry about certain aspects of the land management. And then to really work on that goal so that when they have that goal and they read it to themselves or to their family or their business, however that group is set up, that they get a sense of ownership. Like it feels comfortable, like they can base every decision off of that goal. Then you can start moving forward with the rest of the process, and definitely including, from Savory, he talks about the 4 ecosystem processes, which is water, community, minerals, and energy. Within NRCS, we have what we call our resource concerns, which look at soil, water, plants, animals, energy. I feel like I'm missing one. I'm glad this isn't a quiz, but and then the other thing is looking at tools. What kind of tools are available to implement these management plans? And money and labor is probably, for the majority, the item that we have the most limited amount of. Human creativity is probably the one that we most underutilize. Going back to that picture of kind of that traditional farmer or landowner that we typically work with, they're not usually asked to dream about how they want their property to look. They're used to just kind of moving through every to-do list that they need to get done. And my favorite part of my job is when I ask people to really kind of do that, like, farm plan, that dream plan that they have. You almost see a sparkle in their eye go off, because we don't usually think about creativity when it comes to land management. We think about addressing problems and getting them to fix them. So it's definitely an area that we encourage in this planning process. I know with fires burning right now, fire is not always a tool that we like to utilize, but it is one that is available. Rest, just like ourselves. I mean, we're so used to always going, that rest is a tool that we underutilize as well, especially on the land. And oftentimes when we look at addressing those resources, that might very well be a tool that we need to implement. Same with grazing. So again, grazing is just a tool in holistic land management. It's not the whole thing that we're looking at. Animal impact, living organisms above and below the soil, all of those are definitely tools. And technology is probably the tool that we overutilize the most. We always kind of think that if we can utilize technology, we might be able to, get ourselves out of certain problems in regards to land management. And it's not always the case, but definitely it's still a tool that we can use. And then anytime that we implement a plan, we want to test those decisions. We want to evaluate those resources from an economic and environmental perspective. And then lastly, the part that I feel that's one of the most effectives on are we actually doing a good job is to monitor some more and monitor, and there's a multitude of different ways you can monitor how effective these practices are, but the best ones that are going to work are the ones that you actually do. So I always recommend people keep it simple. We all have access to phones that take pictures, we can download certain stuff. So I usually recommend photo monitoring is the best way to kind of start. And so this is kind of a real life situation. This is one I stepped foot on quite a few years ago. And so when you look at this property, you probably are thinking your own conclusions when you look at this. I know when I stepped on it, it was kind of a feeling of despair, like, oh my gosh, where do we even start? And, there's a lot of things that are kind of going wrong here. But what was going right was that the particular landowner had just acquired this property through a lease, and he had been implementing holistic land management. And I was just a tool in his management plan to help him address what are some of the resource concerns that we have. So we obviously have, soil erosion, we have rill erosion, we have some compaction issues, forage. We're deterring away from our, ecological states on this particular property. So it helped us to really evaluate that and implement a plan. And then we put together a monitoring process. And this was several years ago, and now he's starting to see a shift, of those native plant communities starting to come in. But it's an amazing process to really look at land management and not just addressing that. A lot of times we'll have people contact our office on this particular site and they want a grass seed because they want to fix this problem, but maybe not always look at the whole. This is the criteria that we use, which is our National Resource Concern and Planning criteria. This goes through all of our different natural resource concerns and different ways that we can assess those to kind of gauge the health of the land. And, this is just an example of things that we look at. I feel that it's kind of like being a land doctor, although they haven't changed my title to that. But it's one of those that we're out there really evaluating the overall health of the land. What's kind of going on, and being able to, measure those and monitor that so that we can really develop a plan that can help that producer incorporate that into their operation and their management plans. And I should have put some invasive species in here, so sorry about that, Tina. But those are also things that we're looking at, because it's just like when we go to the doctor, if we're running a fever, or if we've got stomach aches, the doctors look for those certain signs, and we're looking for those on the land. The land oftentimes tells us a story far beyond what we can put together just doing a look. It just takes time to really dive through that. And so got about a minute left. And this is probably my favorite quote when it comes to land management and the work that I do, is that, oftentimes people call us because they need help right away. And oftentimes we want a quick fix to those problems. And we have to kind of stop sometimes just pulling people out of the river. And oftentimes we need to go upstream and really find out while they're falling in. Why are we having those problems? Why are we seeing an influx of maybe salinity or compaction or invasive species, and really help them in developing that system so that they can begin to manage it for a whole. So I think I'm out of time, and I'll go ahead and close, and then I guess we will follow up with questions later. So thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. That was great. Really appreciate that insight to holistic land management. While we switch to our next presenter, I want to remind everyone, if you look in the top right-hand corner, the little bubble that says chat, if you guys would enter your questions in for our speakers, we'll have a Q&A session at the end when we're through all of our presentations. So looks like Tina's presentation is up, so I'll mute and turn it over to Tina.
Yay, thank you so much, Rusty. I appreciate that. So let's go ahead and get started. I kind of threw in the word fall because we're at the end of the year, and fall seems to be what everybody's thinking about, and pumpkin spice lattes and all that good stuff. There we go. So why do we manage weeds? This is really a personal question that every landowner and manager needs to ask themselves. It's important to think about what you want out of your property and what resources you have to make all of this happen. And what are you trying to accomplish, what your goals are, and figure out then the best choices for that management. So like we talked about briefly, is fall. And fall is a generic term that we use. The days are shorter, we're getting less sunlight, the nights are cooler. We lucked out, thankfully, last week. We only got into the low 30s, so we had a light frost instead of usually that hard freeze is in the 20s where the plants shut down and then we're out of work and of the ability to treat our noxious weeds, except for Russian knapweed. So typically we think of fall in general as September, October, regardless of what the calendar tells us that it's still summertime. So our annuals are important to keep in mind when we're trying to figure out the best control options. Is their whole goal is to make seed. So they are very prolific seed producers and working to produce that seed. They respond the best to herbicides in the early growth stages, or that can be fall or spring, depending if they're a winter annual or a summer annual. And by the fall, they're usually working at dying, but some are starting to grow, again, if they're that winter annual. And if you've kept them mowed throughout the season, then they're going to be producing seed just shorter and closer to the ground. Our biennials, also being a 2-year plant, are great seed producers. And the best time to treat them is in the rosette stage. This can be either the fall or the spring. And then by fall, usually they're mature, and so we're looking at deadheading them. If they've been mowed off, they might be working at doing some regrowth and coming on from there. Whereas our perennials, they're reproducing from seeds and roots, and their best control is achieved through using multiple methods to get through to them, whether that's combining grazing or mowing with herbicides or some biocontrol with some herbicides. Fall is a great time to treat them, but spring is also equally effective, especially if you don't think you're going to have that time in the summer and the fall to follow up with them, and you get another year's worth of seed production. So I always remind everybody that there's no one way to control the weeds. The sky is the limit with their different options and combinations. What works for one person may not work for you. Again, going back to Sylvia's talk and how people manage their land and what their overall goal is. So let's get into the weed ID. I figured that's going to be what everybody wants to see the most. And so we're going to go through, I'll break them up in annuals, biennials, or perennials. If there's an A, B, or C, it tells you if it's on the state noxious weed list. And then N is for native plants and NN is for non-native plants. So let us dive right in. So like on our annual weed species, we're looking at a pre-emergent control options or our post-emergent control options. Pulling or digging. So if they don't have a large infestation, it might be most effective to dig them up. We can look at doing some regular mowings, but again, they're going to seed out below that mower height, and that timing for when you mow them is going to be very critical. We've got disking as an option for those annual species, but that creates ground disturbance and causes more seeds to germinate, although that may be your goal ultimately. And then a lot of the species can be grazed, but that's when we worry about toxicity concerns and our stocking rates. So as we talk about these annuals, keep all of these different options in mind. I'm only going to focus on the chemical options throughout the presentation that allow for grazing. So I did select just the range and pasture type products that we can use. Everybody's favorite, Kochia. Let's see. So it was introduced from Asia to Europe and then on to America in the 1900s as an ornamental plant because we are very smart and we think that we need flowers. It is what we call a winter annual. So typically it's going to start germination in February, March, and then live out its life and die fairly early on in the summer. But it seems to keep germinating as much as I'm frustrated with it. It does have a high protein content, so we do use it for grazing. It's also known as tumbleweed, but it's the tumbleweed without stickers or pokies that catches up in the fences. It can be toxic to livestock as it accumulates those nitrates and turns into the red stems and that red picture there in the middle of the screen. Some various studies have found that kochia germination went from an initial level of 40 to 76% the year after the seed is produced, down to 5% the second year and almost 0 by the third year. So the encouraging part is it doesn't have a long seed life in the soil. It's just a prolific seed producer and will take over given any amount of chance. And some subspecies of kochia have become resistant to our common herbicides, which is also very frustrating. Russian thistle starts out very much grass-like, as in the upper right picture. It is what we call a summer annual, so it's going to usually come on that April, May, and later through the summer. It's the tumbleweed with pokies or stickers. Its flowers are pink to white. It also can accumulate nitrates. And usually about 30 to 60% a seed that is germinated in 1 year will germinate that is created in 1 year will germinate the following year, and then it drops off to 0.5% afterwards, and then even less come that third year. So again, it's that initial seed production and that initial year after the seed is produced that we really need to target and get control of. So puncture vine or goat heads, everybody's other most favorite option, is that it likes to germinate when the heat comes on. So I tell most landowners June, July, all the way through October is when we're going to be dealing with the puncture vine. The flowers will turn into the fruits, and there's 5 burrs with each fruit. And then there's multiple seeds stacked within each burr, separated by a hard membrane. The seeds are viable for 3 to 7 years, so this is a long-term plan to try to control it. The hardest part is for a lot of people with livestock is that consumption of puncture vine or tribulus can cause tribulosis in sheep. and the toxins in the plant can cause kidney and liver damage. So it's not one that we want to look at grazing with on a regular basis. Prickly lettuce, another favorite infestation for overgrazed areas. It's very much thistle-like. The spines are going up the stem as well as the back midrib of the leaf. It does have a milky sap. It flowers July through September. The young plants are readily eaten by deer and livestock, and the mature plants have become very bitter and unpalatable. Common mallow is also called cheese wheel based on the seed shape and size and texture. It's usually an annual, but sometimes can act like a biennial. It flowers April through October, and the flowers are white, pink to light lilac. It has that typical geranium type of a leaf on it. It is one that causes yolk discoloration in stored eggs if the chickens consume the seeds. So it's important to know the vegetation, and if you are looking at grazing, what livestock source you're grazing with to see if they can handle it or it'll give you issues. Horseweed or mare's tail usually flowers June through September. The tiny flowers are white to pink, and the narrow long leaves have very fine hairs. It has a strong pungent odor from the turpentine oils in it. It also contains tannic and gallic acid that can cause skin and mucosal irritations in humans and livestock, especially horses. So if, oh, gotta love it when you mess up your notes, right? So these are the typical chemical control options that we think about with these annual weed species. A lot of the 2,4-D based products. I love Telar for puncture vine. It's a great pre-emergent, early post-emergent product that allows for grazing, gives you that good season-long control. We've also got the Pendulum Prowl and the new ones on the market being the Rejuvra, which is a great option. If you have the chemical resistant subspecies varieties, we do have some chemical options that will work for their control. So again, it's going to be kind of a pick and choose, price-wise, your timing, the rates, what your overall goals are as to how to best address those species. And lastly, on the annuals, cheatgrass, everybody's favorite nemesis that we're talking so much about. Thank you to Rejuvra. It is a winter annual grass that germinates anywhere between August to December, depending on when we get moisture. It goes dormant over winter. It's the first grass to green up, and it's usually dead in June and July and helping fuel all of our lovely wildfires. The seeds are viable for 3 to 5 years. It's very soft, hairy, fuzzy grass that's palatable and provides good nutrition when it's young. The problem is when it matures. And at the maturity side, it's when it causes a lot of hurt to the animals. In sheep, we call it lumpy jaw because those seeds get in and burrow into their jaw lines and give them problems from eating it. If you do mow it, it also goes and makes seed closer to the ground. So again, like we talked about, there are some chemical options, and the newest kid on the block being Rejuvra. It provides about 2 years worth of control with one treatment. The hard part is it's $8 to $10 an ounce on average. Right now you can only buy it in 2.5 gallons, and they are, hopefully next year we'll have it in quart sizes that you can purchase to use in smaller settings. But Rejuvra has really changed our options for control of cheatgrass, releasing our natives and giving us what we want to see in our pastures and ranges and open space and parks. So on to our biennial species. Again, we can look at the pre-emergent and post-emergent chemical options. We can dig up the rosettes if we don't have a lot. We can deadhead our plants. We've got our mowing that we could do. A lot's going to depend on the timing, as well as regular disking. And then we can do some grazing. But again, we've got to be worried about our toxicity rates and stocking rates. Our first one, musk thistle, was introduced from Europe and Asia in the late 1800s as a contaminant in our ballast soil that came across on the ships, and possibly as an ornamental. We also call it nodding thistle because that large flower head nods over. The stalk is bare coming up to that flower. There's a white margin along the leaf edge and that midrib. Sometimes it's a purple, but that's one of the key identifying marks on it. And then we do have a biocontrol option, which is a seed feeding weevil. However, it only targets the terminal flowers of the plant. And as you can see, the plant produces a lot of flowers. So it'll reduce the seed, but not completely eliminate the seed that the plant produces. Scotch thistle was introduced from Europe and Asia in the 1800s as an ornamental. You've got the spined wings going all the way up to the very erect flower. The leaves are very fuzzy and hairy, and the stalks get very large in diameter. That makes it very difficult to chop them down. Bull thistle, again, was a European biennial that came over in the 1800s, possibly as an ornamental or as a seed contaminant. It looks very similar to our Scotch thistle, but the spined wings coming up to the flower are very smaller, much smaller. It's got finer leaves, more dissected coming into that margin. And then the flowers are more of an urn shape versus what the Scotch gives us. Diffuse snapweed was from the Mediterranean and Asia area in the 1800s as a seed contaminant with alfalfa. It's a simple, it's usually a biennial, sometimes can act as a simple perennial. And if it is a perennial, it typically will live for 2 to 6 years. It has a white flower that can sometimes be pink. The yellow spines under the flowers stick out and are very pokey, kind of like a thistle part. And then it spreads its seeds through breaking and tumbling with the wind. A plant can produce up to 900 seeds that are viable for up to 12 years. Common mullein has the very thick fuzzy leaves. It's typically a single stalk flower unless it's been mowed or grazed, and then it has multiple branches on it. The seeds are viable for over 80 years. And the plant was purposefully introduced for its medicinal properties used in respiratory issues. And we can take it either through teas, pills, or smoking. Western salsify is typically a biennial. However, it can act like a short-lived perennial. Its very grass-like leaves have a milky sap in it. It does respond to our broadleaf products. It flowers May through July and forms that large dandelion puffball. It's seldom grazed, and it loves the graded sites to grow in. Curly cup gumweed is, again, another typical biennial. However, it can act as a short-lived perennial. It's very sticky and resinous, especially around the flowers. It has serrated edges on the leaves. It can accumulate selenium and become toxic to livestock. And an extract of its leaves and buds is used in modern medicine to treat whooping cough and asthma. And these are the typical herbicides that we think about when it comes to treating our biennials, with Milestone being the gold standard, providing roughly 90-ish% control versus your 2,4-D down around the lower percentages, 40% at least in the perennials type species. Perennials. Again, with the perennials, we're going to look at spraying them in the spring, or we can combine that with mowing and grazing and then follow up with herbicide treatment at the right timing. We can deep plow or till, which is going to break up that root mass, but it's going to spread most of those creeping perennials that we are dealing with. We can spray them in the fall. Our simple perennials could be dug out if needed. I definitely encourage people to plan on 3 to 5 years of continuous work and then establish healthy competition. Our first kid is Canada thistle. He was introduced in the 1600s as a contaminant with farm seeds or animals from Europe or Africa. Typically, they're about 3 feet tall, tiny flowers about the size of your thumb. They can get up to 6 feet tall in the perfect conditions. Individual plants can produce up to 1,500 seeds, but there must be both male and female plants in the vicinity for successful pollination. About 90% of the seeds will germinate within 1 year, but other seeds will remain viable for up to 20 years, and the seeds can be blown in the wind for up to a half a mile away from an infestation. With the creeping perennials, this is what we're dealing with, is that large underground root mass. In Canada, thistle can produce up to 364 feet of roots in about 4.5 months. We have a couple of biocontrol options, one being rust and gall flies and stem mining weevils. I don't have much experience with the other two, but on the rust, it takes about 3 years to fully infest an infestation of plants and reduce them and kill them out. The whole time, though, they are still making viable seed. And I've accidentally treated some plants with the rust infestation on them. And unfortunately, it slowed the effectiveness of the herbicide down. So catch-22. Timing in the spring is going to be from 6 to 10 inches of growth up to early bud, or in our fall. And again, these would be the best herbicide options of choice. Russian knapweed was introduced from Europe and Asia in the 1890s as an alfalfa seed contaminant. Again, we've got another lovely creeping perennial. There have been some stands that have been in existence for over 75 years. It's typically about 3 feet tall. It's very toxic to horses and affects their nervous system. A single plant can produce up to 1,200 seeds per year that are viable for 2 to 8 years in the soil. And it's also very allelopathic, which means that it puts a chemical down in the ground so that other plants can't grow. And yeah, you lose out your grasses and everything else that you're trying to grow and keep going. Our control options are treating it in the spring at bud to early flower stage, so it's a much later treatment of Russian knapweed, or in the fall, even up through November when the plant appears dead, they've still gotten great success with. And these would be a couple of the primary ones, with Milestone being the best choice. Leafy spurge was introduced from Europe in the 1600s and 1700s, and then from Russian Mennonites in the late 1800s. So we got it twofold. It has that milky sap, creeping perennial. It can shoot the seeds up to 15 feet away. And there are a couple biocontrol options. I haven't had much success with them and getting them established in Weld County, but definitely look into it in other cities and states I've been. That's done fabulous for people. Here you want to treat them in the spring at the true flower stage or the fall. And again, primarily we're looking at that plateau or panoramic as the best options. Hoary cress was introduced in the late 1800s, early 1900s as an alfalfa seed contaminant from Europe and Asia. It is, again, that creeping perennial, and there's 3 different types based on their seed and how the seeds look, but they all treat the same. We also call hoary cress white top. It's about 1 foot tall, versus perennial pepperweed, which is tall white top. It was introduced from Europe and Asia in 1900s as a contaminant, most likely with sugar beet seeds. Again, that creeping perennial, it's 2 to 4 feet tall, has little white flowers on the top that kind of form balls. And like that bottom picture, an infestation like that can produce over 6 billion seeds per acre. Treatment for the mustards is going to be bud to early bloom stage or in the fall rosette. And those are going to be then our best herbicide options, where I've had the most success with the Escort and the Telar. And I know I'm running down on time, so we'll finish up here with bindweed, which is believed to have been introduced around the 1870s as a contaminant in wheat from Turkey. Yay. Again, creeping perennial. It flowers June through September. It can cause mild distress in swine, and the seeds are viable for up to 50 years. Woohoo! There are a couple biocontrol options, one being the mite and another being a moth. The goal of both of them, and it's the effect that I've seen from the mites, is that it reduces the plant vigor and it decreases seed development and formation so that hopefully the plant can weaken and die out through normal attrition. And then these would be the seed control options, or the spraying options. It wants to be done more in the flower stage than less, and or fall. And we're looking at the 2,4-D dicambas, plateau if you have that option and don't have any good grasses around that you want to keep, and the glyphosate, because that plateau, they encouraged it to be at that higher 10 to 12 ounce rate, which could hurt some other grasses. So that is all I have for now, and then we can go into questions and later, and I'll turn it over to Kara and Scott.
Thank you, Tina. I want to remind everyone, if you have questions, to click on the chat box and enter your questions there. We will be having a recording of all the presentations at the link that I provided in the chat box, so you can access those via our website after the webinar is done. So I think we're ready to turn it over to Scott Nissen.
Okay, well, thanks for the invitation, and I appreciate everybody who's hung around. I'm going to talk about something a little bit different, and that's to focus in on this whole issue of herbicide resistance and what kind of impacts it may have if you're trying to do any kind of ecological restoration. The picture I have there is from my days working with tamarisk after a fire down around Rocky Ford, and how quickly the tamarisk is able to regenerate from the root crowns. Why don't you go to the next slide? Okay, doing some of that early work. This is actually from a project we did down in Canyon City many years ago, but we were doing single plant treatments with a herbicide called imazapyr or Habitat. And what became very obvious after doing these treatments is we had excellent success controlling the tamarisk, but in that area around the tamarisk where we had a little product come off or was actually accidentally oversprayed, we had a carpet of kochia. And that's what the picture on the right shows, is that overspray was able to keep out the cheatgrass, which is very sensitive to imazapyr. But there was a whole bunch of kochia coming up underneath these trees that we had treated with Habitat. And this site is not in any kind of agricultural area where the resistance may have come in from agricultural applications, but came in from just from windblown pollen. So we're actually not too far from the Supermax prison down in Canyon City. So that led me to realize that, let's go to the next slide, Kara, that what we have with kochia is probably a poster child for a weed that's extremely well adapted to our area. And it's going to be a problem regardless of whether you're growing crops, trying to establish native grasses, or essentially trying to achieve bare ground. It seems like no matter what your goal is, the kochia is going to be one of the most difficult weeds that you have to control. Tina gave a little bit of an introduction about the species, so we'll just leave it at that it's extremely well adapted to our environment, salt tolerant, drought tolerant, everything you can imagine. But it led us to this idea that that it also at the same time had the genetic potential to develop resistance to all sorts of different herbicides. And the one that happened first was ALS, or Telar, for example, would be a common herbicide that's in that mode of action, producing resistance to that very quickly. In fact, in a matter of just a few years, when Telar was released up in Montana as a herbicide called Glean for wheat, resistance showed up in about 5 years. So this next slide sort of shows you the impact of herbicide resistance worldwide and how it's from about the 1980s has been steadily increasing. This particular figure shows the number of unique cases of herbicide resistance worldwide. And you can see we're now exceeding 475 unique cases of herbicide resistance. I'll just kind of, yeah, that's a good, Kara, that's when I kind of stop talking, then you change slides, okay?
Perfect.
That'll be our signal. So anyway, but it's not uniformly distributed across all the different ways that herbicides work. And if you look at this diagram here, it splits those 475 cases out into different types of herbicide resistance. And that red circle that's going up much higher than everything else is ALS resistance, and ALS herbicides are things like Escort and Telar that Tina previously mentioned. Okay, I wanted to point out one thing. If you think you might be dealing with a herbicide-resistant weed, there's an excellent resource called the International Survey for Herbicide-Resistant Weeds, and the URL is listed right there. And what I always do when somebody calls me and says, you know, I think I have a resistant weed, this is the first place I go to see if it's been reported anywhere else, because this is basically a consortium of an international consortium where information on different types of herbicide resistance is cataloged. And so you can actually search this database by the weed species or the mode of action that you're using, and you can find out if anybody else has reported, because it's very good likelihood if it's been reported before, then that probably indicates that you might be dealing with herbicide resistance. Okay, and I just included this particular picture to indicate that now this is glyphosate resistance, not ALS resistance. And this is first reported in Kochia with that little red arrow back in about 2009 or 2010. We've been seeing much more glyphosate-resistant kochia in Colorado, mainly because in the western or the eastern plains, we've been using glyphosate to substitute for tillage to do no-till wheat production. So in that fallow season, growers were using glyphosate instead of tillage to conserve soil moisture, because you save the straw residue on the surface that helps trap snow, and just all around was much better than using tillage. So we in Colorado wound up with glyphosate resistant kochia, not because we necessarily overused glyphosate or because we had a lot of Roundup Ready crop technology, but because we were using it in place of tillage. So what I wanted to talk about was some work that we did this past year. I don't know how many of you were aware of the fact that we had to cancel our annual CSU Weed Tour this year, and we did a virtual tour where we went around to a bunch of different field experiments, and we recorded little videos, most of them less than 5 minutes, talking about the different sites, and then we posted them all on YouTube. And we had pretty good success. It wasn't nearly as much fun as loading up a couple of big CSU buses and driving around the countryside, but at least it made people aware that we were still continuing to do our work at CSU. And what we did, one of the stops on this tour was I designed, before we were told we couldn't have the physical tour, was to really show people in a very visual way what we're talking about when we talk about herbicide resistance, using kochia as the main species to focus on. So we developed a series of treatments, some applied pre, some applied post, but to a site where we knew there was incredible kochia pressure. And then we have sort of evaluated them over the growing season. And then in, I'd say, early June, we got together with one of my colleagues, Dr. Todd Gaines, and we went out and filmed a really nice video that's pretty in-depth. This is about 20 minutes and talks a lot about more in-depth herbicide mode of action. But what I'm going to talk, I'm going to go through the same plots, but I'm going to really make it more practical and not so much down into the biochemistry of the mode of action. Okay, so this plot just demonstrates, and you can see the Tellar sign is in the middle of the plot. The two wooden stakes toward the back are the edges. But you wouldn't know that this is not the untreated control if I didn't have the sign in the middle of the plot. Because we assume that 70 to 90% of all the kochia we have in Colorado is already ALS resistant. Now, the problem with ALS resistance is there's no fitness penalty. And by fitness penalty, I mean that those kochia plants that are carrying the resistance gene are just as prolific and grow just as fast and produce just as many seeds as plants who do not carry the resistance gene. So therefore, it spreads through a population, and because it's not deleterious in any way, it can remain in the population even if you stop using Tellar for long periods of time. But that's just to show you what we normally expect to see with an ALS herbicide on a population of kochia here in Colorado. This is in Boulder County, by the way. Okay, the next one that's we have had a lot of success using combinations of method and esplanade. Tina mentioned esplanade before. Method is a good product. I didn't finish that last sentence, but it's provided two modes of action. And the interesting thing is that by itself, method is not a very good post-emergence herbicide, but pre-emergence, in combination with esplanade, and Tina already mentioned that there is a new version called Rejuvera that has a registration for use with grazed domestic livestock. So we have two versions. Esplanade is kind of the non-crop roadside right-of-way, and Rejuvera will be for rangeland and areas where you'll be grazing domestic livestock. But you can see that compared to that Tellar treatment, we had pretty good control. A lot of that green stuff growing up there is not kochia. I think it's mostly white top, because there's quite a bit of white top in this area. Okay, we look at another totally different mode of action, but one which we are kind of encouraging people to think about how they might include into a restoration program, because Jim Sebastian, who does a lot of the restoration work down in Boulder County, has been using Portfolio once the grasses get established, and they don't have to be, giant, 300 tiller grasses or anything. They can just be established with 1 or 2 tillers, and you can use Portfolio as a pre-emergence herbicide for control of kochia. It has a different mode of action. You can combine it with other products, but you can see from this particular slide that, again, that's a lot of what's growing in that plot is white top, which you wouldn't have any impact on, but it did an excellent job of controlling the kochia. I've put in this slide because it represents a really interesting dilemma that we have, and that is the fact that we have lots and lots of kochia in Colorado which can no longer be controlled with dicamba post-emergence. But what we have found is that it works fairly well pre, and so this is just to demonstrate the fact that even though most of this kochia here has some level of dicamba resistance, you can get some fairly reasonable control with dicamba using it as a pre-emergence herbicide, because dicamba does have pre-emergence activity, and so you can use it in a pre-emergence way and still get some fairly good activity. But we haven't quite figured out why this happens, why it doesn't work post but will work pre. We're working on that. And this is one that Piper is one that demonstrates sort of the whole idea about why we were doing this little project. We're trying to encourage people to think about doing kochia control pre-emergence rather than post-emergence. It's easy to think about, well, I won't worry about the kochia. I'm just going to come in with Vista, and that should clean up the kochia. And we'll talk a little bit later about what's wrong with that strategy, but mainly it's the fact that we don't want to put too much pressure on Vista because it's really the only post-emergence selective herbicide we can use when we're doing restoration work. But Piper is an excellent product because it's a combination of two fairly different modes of action, flumioxazin and peroxysulfone. Flumioxazin and the active ingredient portfolio have the same mode of action. There's not a lot of resistance to that mode of action in Kochia. So it's a good choice. It's also selective from the standpoint that if things are well established, it's not going to have any much or very little activity on any grass or forb or shrub that's well established. It's going to work mainly on things that are just germinating. And we also like to encourage multiple modes of action when trying to address a problem like Kochia. And I threw in this one because it's one of my most favorite herbicides because it works so well and it's so inexpensive. Unfortunately, it does not have a non-crop label. It used to have a rangeland label back in the 90s. A lot of atrazine went out at very low rates because it's very good for controlling cheatgrass. And when we lost the label, when the EPA withdrew the label for rangeland, I have a feeling if you look back at the data, you could see a significant increase in the spread of downy brome once we lost the use of atrazine. Mainly because you could get 2 years of cheatgrass control with atrazine at a cost of probably $1 an acre. So it was very cost effective. The reason it's interesting here is because when I first came to Colorado in the mid-90s, atrazine was really falling out of favor because there was so much resistance. The thing about this is that resistance to the PS2 herbicides carries a penalty. The plants are not as fit. Their photosynthetic activity is reduced by about 30%, so there is what we call a fitness penalty. But if you stop using it for a number of years, you can see that right now it's providing 100% control, and this control held up till just recently. In fact, it held up through most of the growing season. So it was very impressive, but I like to throw this in because it demonstrates this whole idea of why we need to understand what the mechanism of resistance is. Does it carry a fitness penalty or not? If it does, then we have different options. If it doesn't carry a fitness penalty, then we're really in big trouble. All right, last but not least, this is really what I wanted to talk about, and this is the fact that we have this product called Vista. There's a generic that Alligary sells with the very clever name of fluroxapyr, which is really not that clever, but I guess it gets the job done. And this little plot shows the difference between 12 ounces, which is kind of our standard single use rate, and the maximum use rate of 23 ounces per acre. 23 ounces is the most you can use in one growing season. So that would be the most you could use for an entire, for a year. But you can see that while it did do a pretty good job, the Kochia was at the right stage when we made the application. You can see, especially at that 12 ounce rate, there's a number of green plants in there that are still hanging on. And while we don't have the data to support the claim of Vista or fluroxapyr resistance, it has been reported on the HRAC website. So we're really concerned, or I am, that we need to minimize our dependence on fluroxapyr or Vista because it really is our only post-emergence option when especially when we're doing grass establishment. And this just sort of reiterates the things I was just mentioning, that Vista or fluroxapyr is such a useful tool, especially when we're dealing with a site where we've seeded grasses and they're still fairly small. Grasses tolerate Vista very well. So if you have a site that's being overrun, you've got a few little grasses coming up, Vista represents the option to save that seeding and give you a chance to get things established. One of my grad students is doing a project at DIA, and we gave the den people some help with restoration, or not really restoration, some native grass establishment around the fire station that's right on Pena Boulevard, and it was a total mess. We went in there and just said, well, we told the contractor, apply the 12-ounce rate of fluroxapyr, and they were able to irrigate a little bit, and now it's an amazing stand of native grass, and it's all because we were able to save those native grasses from competition from the Kochia using Vista. But I am very concerned that now we have a couple of cases reported on the website. It's really, on the HRAC website, we really need to be careful and be very judicious with how we use fluroxapyr or Vista. And just some things to think about. We're definitely encouraging applicators to think about pre-emergence control of Kochia with some of the products I've talked about, if it fits into the system, and to really limit the use of Vista and fluroxapyr, and glyphosate, because we have so much, we're putting a lot of pressure on Vista, and we already have quite a bit of glyphosate-resistant Kochia. Many of the populations in the Kochia populations in the West are multiple resistant, so they're not only resistant to ALS herbicides, but they may also be dicamba and glyphosate resistant, for example. So on the Eastern Plains, we have populations that carry multiple resistance. And if you think you might have a herbicide resistance issue, like I mentioned in the beginning, please check that HRAC website to see if it's that particular weed has been reported to be resistant to that herbicide in some other location, because that information will all be available on the HRAC website. And that's it.
All right, thanks, Scott. And thank you to all of our presenters. Fabulous information, very, very useful. I want to remind everybody we have some time for question and answer. Again, click on the little bubble icon and enter your question in there for our presenters, and I'll wait and see if there's any, if we have any questions, but I have a couple that I'm gonna just kick off with, if that's okay. You know, my first one is for Scott Nissen. Scott, what is, looking into your crystal ball, what's the most critical or concerning thing with resistance? Is there a new species coming out that you're finding more resistance? Is there an old one that's becoming more resistant? Do you have any predictions?
Rusty, that's a great question. The one that most people are concerned about is Palmer amaranth. It makes Kochia look kind of weak and not very competitive. The problem right now is that we've got Palmer on the eastern part of the state in the corn and bean fields and things like that, but it is native actually to the southwestern deserts of all places. When they check the do DNA fingerprinting to check its origins, it's actually native to Arizona and New Mexico. So that is probably the weed that concerns me the most. As Tina mentioned, we now have a great tool for managing cheatgrass and lots of other winter annual grasses. Didn't mention the fact that Rejuvera also has activity on Ventonata and Medusa head, which fortunately we don't have in Colorado. But if I had to pick another thing we're concerned about, because Wyoming has Ventonata and Utah has Medusa head, that looking for those two grasses to be moving, those two winter annual grasses to be moving into Colorado, that would be my other big concern.
All right, great, thank you. We have a question about pre-emergence for Kochia. So maybe this is Tina Booten, maybe Scott Nissen. When is the best time to treat for Kochia pre-emergence?
Well, I'll start and then Scott can fill in. A lot's going to depend on what product you're looking at using. If you're going to use the Rejuvra or the Esplanade, I wouldn't hesitate putting it down here in the fall, somewhere in that October, November window, as long as the ground's not frozen and there's no snow on it. If you're going to use a product more like Pendulum or Prowl, I would probably wait till spring and then add another product to it to catch any of those that have germinated. Because remember, Kochia germinates, typically speaking, that February, March window. So if it's a pre-emergent, you just have to make sure you put it down prior to that germination, that weather allows.
Okay, I'll just chime in a little bit. I would totally agree. We have had the best luck with these pre-emergence treatments with fall applications. We've even gone as late as December for some of them, and especially when we were first working with Esplanade, one of our recommendations was just about any time during the winter months when the ground wasn't frozen, and then tank mixing it with glyphosate in order to kill any downy brome that had already established. But we've also had good luck. Those treatments that we put out for the slideshow that I just presented, we applied those in April, and we generally don't get as good an activation with those spring treatments because we have less consistent rainfall. So fall is probably the best time to get those products out because you have more time for them to be incorporated and activated. And that's really important for those pre-emergence herbicides. The other thing I would point out is that if you have the option to go with higher gallons per acre, say 30 gallons as opposed to 20, we think that there's a benefit to that. The other thing I would mention is that Rejuvra or Esplanade is pretty lipophilic, or very low water solubility. Let me put it that way. So applying it with something like a regular boom sprayer seems to be more efficacious than applying it with boomless. I've got a little UTV and it's really handy to use those boomless nozzles, but we've seen that using a standard boom sprayer actually works better for things like, for many of these pre-emergence herbicides, but especially for things like Esplanade or Rejuvra.
Okay, great, thank you. Our next question is from Jonathan. He said, any recommendations for restoration of Kochia infestations that have been mowed in the fall, then they plan to treat with glyphosate in the spring? When would be a good time to seed with native grass and forbs?
Okay, where does this person live? Jonathan?
Jonathan is, I believe, from Grand Staircase Escalante, so around Escalante, Utah.
Okay. Oh, that's a tough one because we recommend fall dormant seeding or timings for planting grasses. So we really like to see people planting in November, but I don't know if that would apply to that part of the world. I mean, it's such a different location. I'm a little hesitant to make a recommendation because I don't know that area very well, but we've had better luck with fall, dormant season. We don't want them to come up in the fall. We just want them to be in the ground and getting exposed to the variations in temperature, because that helps sometimes to break any dormancy when they get cold and warm and cold and warm. I also see that he has native forbs. One thing that we have learned, and a lot of it had to do with some really good work that was done at the Arsenal, was that it's much better to get your native grasses established first before you try to get forbs established. And sometimes the forbs will come in on their own, either from the soil seed bank or, I don't know, maybe from wildlife. But we've always had better luck if we stabilize the site with native grass, minimize the annual weed pressure. That's when you can start thinking about coming in with forbs. The seed mixes that have 15 different grasses and a whole bunch of different forbs, in my opinion, are doomed to failure because there isn't one weed species or one grass, for example, that can start to stabilize the system.
Great, thanks, Scott. And we have had some luck with fall seeding as well. As Scott said, you can take advantage of the freeze-thaw cycles in the soil and creates cracks, and some of that seed gets in the cracks and starts to germinate in a lot of our restoration areas. Again, yeah, we're not exactly sure for recommendations in Escalante, but I hope that helps, Jonathan. Next question is, do you have any suggestions for control of stink net, aka globe chamomile? This plant is becoming pervasive in low desert areas in Arizona. Scott, Tina, probably question if you can.
I would not have a good recommendation at this point. Why don't we? You've got Jenny's contact information, so we could send her an email.
Yes, I think we can get a hold of Jenny, or if Jenny, if you want to put it in the chat box, we'll try to get you some answers back on that one.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to speculate because that's what it would be, just off the top of my head.
Okay. Sylvia, a question for you. What is the one thing that you would like to have people walk away with knowing about holistic restoration? You know, maybe the cornerstone of holistic restoration that they can start thinking about or moving towards better management from a holistic standpoint. Do you have any just, you know, brass tacks walk away that people should start considering?
Yeah, great question, Rusty. I think one of the kind of takeaways is just being able to kind of zoom out. We tend to zoom in on a particular problem or issues, and weeds are always kind of that one thing that we look at as, you know, kind of a glaring issue on the landscape. But just to be able to kind of really zoom out your perspective and what is going on the landscape, taking into consideration all those resource concerns. Sometimes we might address the weeds and control those, but we end up missing what's actually bringing those weeds into the property. Sometimes it's grazing management. It could just be poor, you know, ecological conditions at the site. So really being able to assess that, I think, would be my takeaway.
Excellent. Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions for our presenters? Okay. Well, again, I would like to, on behalf of Rivers Edge West, I would like to thank Sylvia, Tina, and Scott for your time and your information and all your work to try to make our areas better across our state and the Southwest. Thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate you taking time out of your day to be with us. We'd like to invite you to become a member of Rivers Edge West. You can find member benefits on our website. Those member dollars really help us provide these webinars and resources for people that really want to make impacts to their jurisdictional boundaries or their lands or their ranch and farming operations. So consider becoming a member of our organization. We greatly appreciate the support, and sign up for our newsletters. These newsletters have important information about funding opportunities, job announcements, upcoming resources. We're going to continue the webinar series. We will be having another webinar series next week, and another in just 1 week. So please join us for that. That'll be September 22nd at 10:30 a.m. It'll be Restoration on Private Lands Part 2, and it's really talking about implementation and biological controls and restoring for birds. So again, this is a continuation of our webinar series that we hope that you guys walk away with good information and can affect your restoration efforts. So with that, Please contact us if you have any information. There will be a recording of this presentation on our website. So thanks again and have a good day.
Thank you, Rusty, for the invitation, and I hope everybody has got something out of this. So just let everybody know they could contact us if they need to. Oh.
Great, thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you guys for having us, and definitely share our information, and be happy to help anyone that has specific questions, or I can email them the presentation, whatever they need.
Thank you all.